Economies in the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC region, were hit particularly hard during 2020 amid the pandemic, and 2021 has brought a considerable amount of risk and uncertainty as these countries look to get back on solid footing. I'm John Weber for AM Best TV. Here to discuss the economic picture in the GCC, which is highlighted in a new report, is Ann Modica, AM Best Associate Director, Credit Rating Criteria Research and Analytics. And Ann, do you think the GCC will rebound economically this year?
So yeah, the good news is the GCC is set to rebound this year, and this is after a pretty challenging 2020. And that although last year was challenging for most of the world's economies, the countries in the GCC were particularly hard hit as they faced a 1-2 punch. So let's look at oil first. We've seen oil prices increase significantly on a year-over-year basis. Last year, between April and May, a barrel Brent crude averaged about $20 to $25 a barrel. That same barrel of oil right now is averaging over $65 a barrel. So, a pretty significant price increase, which will provide a boost to most of the region. And then let's just look at vaccines. So vaccine progress for the region has been somewhat mixed, but the UAE and Bahrain are among the most successful countries with approximately 40% of their total populations fully vaccinated. But then on the other end of the spectrum, we have Kuwait and Oman with less than 5% of their total population fully vaccinated. And this is important because the recent surge in the virus that we saw at the end of the first quarter in the region is a complication for the recovery. So while we're largely positive for the region and the recovery this year, it is somewhat moderated by some potential downside risks.
Now, the GCC region is known for its energy and oil sectors. Given the economic shock of the pandemic, is there now a need to transform these economies?
The pandemic exacerbated and highlighted any prior weakness a country had, and this is really a great example of this. Much of the region is vulnerable to changes in external demand due to the undiversified nature of the economies. If we look at some World Bank statistics, gas and oil production still accounts for over 40% of GDP for 4 of these 6 countries, with Bahrain and the UAE coming in at 20 and 30% of GDP. But then if you look at government revenue, this is just as undiverse, if not more so. Again, 4 of the 6 countries get at least 70% of their revenue from the energy sector, with the exception of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So over the short term, these non-diversified economies will remain vulnerable to conditions that limit demand for energy. Over the longer term, oil reserves will disappear, some sooner than later for some of these countries. Also, if you look at climate change concerns, this will probably play a role in limiting demand.
Now, Ann, the report notes that debt across the GCC region has risen substantially. What's the short and long-term effects of this?
So yeah, debt did rise pretty substantially last year, and this is for 2 main reasons. One, the drop in energy demand and the resulting price decrease reduced government revenue right at a time when the governments were enacting a wide range of spending programs to mitigate against the negative economic and health consequences of the pandemic. Higher debt levels could limit the amount of future spending a government can undertake due to reduced fiscal space. So while most of the countries in the GCC have significant sovereign wealth funds and can kind of manage these increased debt levels, other countries are more vulnerable, particularly when you look at Bahrain and Oman. Additionally, fiscal buffers have eroded somewhat over the last few years, and they do make countries less able to combat future shocks. And even with these substantial fiscal buffers, the IMF does estimate that the GCC countries as a whole will deplete their assets by 2034 unless significant reforms are implemented.
How does the political environment affect operating conditions for the region's insurers?
So the GCC does have a complicated and evolving political environment that can have implications for operational risk in the region. We can compare the GCC operational environment on a relative basis to the rest of the world and by each other by looking at the World Bank ease of doing business indicator surveys. The UAE ranks the best in the region. It ranks 16th overall in the world, so that's a relatively good reading. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have Kuwait, which ranks last in the region and 83rd overall, so kind of like right in the middle of the pack globally. But there is a trend for some of these GCC countries. They tend to score more poorly on factors such as getting credit, trading across borders, as well as resolving insolvencies. And the region could benefit from less regulation, particularly on private companies.
Ann, thanks for speaking with us today.
Thank you, John.
That was Ann Modica, AM Best Associate Director, Credit Rating Criteria Research and Analytics. You can find the full report online at ambest.com. For AM Best TV, I'm John Weber.